Since the beginning of the Horn of Africa's human history, human migrations played an essential role in our diversity. Whether it's for discovery, conquering, or just on accident, ethnicities of all kinds left their imprint on the places we call home today. Yet, because of borders and assimilation, we are blind to the beauty that is right in front of us. Through this video series, we'll begin to lift that blind to see the beauty and diversity in the Horn of Africa with a focus on smaller nations that surround Oromia. Join me today as we go into the neighborhood. The beginning of the 1890s was the end of Sidama rule over Sidama Gopa. It all started when Bensha Aboye, a leader in Menelik's army, led the invasion of Sidama Gopa in the early 1890s to expand Abyssinia further south. King Balicha Warawo, who was the mote of the Hanja subclan at the time, was believed to be the first mote to respond to the incoming threat, mostly because his land was already adjacent to the territory Bensha has already acquired. To organize the defense of Sidama Gopa, he called on the mote of every major clan to strategize, and it was at these meetings that for the betterment of defending Sidama Gopa, that Balicha would be promoted to mote of all Sidama. Even at this elevated level of power, however, clan leaders who were not adjacent to Bensha's approaching army sadly underestimated his army's ability in combat, and were therefore reluctant to send as many military men as they should have. Unbeknownst to them, Bensha's men had weapons that were not yet introduced to the region, namely guns that Menelik was able to secure from Europe, while the Sidama and other southerners still fought with spears and shields. When Balicha saw the capabilities of Bensha's army and the number of men he had, he submitted to the invading army in hopes that Sidama would not be treated as harshly as other nations were. However, that was not the case, as the Gubra system, a form of serfdom used by Menelik, was enforced to the indigenous population, which essentially reduced them to slaves on their own land. However, unlike other nations, Sidama Gopa was able to liberate itself shortly afterwards by the same king who submitted to Bensha. Mote Balicha strategized a rebellion by exploiting Bensha's trust. When Bensha was burdened with moving his soldiers from garrison to garrison, Balicha advised Bensha to separate his troops across all of Sidama Gopa. Foolishly, Bensha took the bait, and even though his army was better armed, the Sidama were better trained, and with Bensha's troops dispersed throughout the country, they were less of a force, and in a matter of months, all his troops were killed off, and he fled Sidama Gopa. Sidama Gopa was once again free. However, it was inevitable that they would be conquered, as all its neighboring nations were. Over a year later, around 1892, a much bigger army under the command of Luz Seged began another invasion. This time it was permanent, and in 1894 it was merged into the Sidama province of Ethiopia, which also included parts of Arsi, Borana, Gedio, and modern-day Showa. According to oral tradition, for revenge for what happened to Bensha, Luz Seged executed the beloved king of Sidama Gopa, Mote Balicha Warawo, in Konso, a Cushitic nation south of Sidama. One notable change that was brought during the invasion that many people do not know of is the term Sidama, which was used to refer to the Sidama nation after Bensha invaded Sidama Gopa between 1891 and 1892. When the term is used to refer to the Sidama, it is offensive. Changing the name of a group of people was a common tactic used to humiliate conquered people during this time. It's similar to calling Oromos or Walaita. That's why during this episode, I'll be only using that term to refer to the province, but not the actual nation. The Sidama shared many of the same experiences with other Southerners during the Solomonic dynasty, the Derg, TPLF and EPRDF, and the Prosperity Party, so I won't dedicate as much time to those experiences because it will be continuously brought up in every episode. However, I will talk about Sidama rebellions and movements that took place during this time period. Since the beginning of Menelik's occupation and throughout the continued rule of the Solomonic dynasty of Sidama Gopa, the Sidama resisted imperial rule. However, they were not organized until Italy controlled Ethiopia during World War II. During this time period, the Sidama people were given more freedom as serfdom and the language ban was lifted off the Sidama. So to many, the Italians were more favorable than the previous Abyssinian settlers. However, at the same time, discriminatory policies were still in force, and when met with resistance, the Italians did not hesitate to end lives. This indiscriminate killing at the hands of the Italians became known as the Umi Shibir, the first terror among the Sidama. During this time, the Sidama continued fighting their former oppressors and had the upper hand until Italy was forced to withdraw from the Ethiopian Empire and Haile Selassie returned to his throne. The Sidama were once again at a disadvantage, and the regime took revenge on the Sidama for what they did during the Italian occupation, so they massacred innocent Sidamas in masses. The most infamous massacre of this time took place in either 1933 or 1943 in Ashisho Sidami Gopa. When the Sidama resisted the return of former government officials on their land, they were massacred. These incidents became known as Leiniki Shibire, the second terror among the Sidama. After the Italian occupation, the Solomonic dynasty continued fighting against unorganized resistance movements in Sidami Gopa until 1974, when the Derg overthrew the dynasty and was supported by Sidamas and many Southerners because of the Derg's land-to-tiller policy, which was perceived at the time to be land reform. The support, however, diminished among the Sidama as it did among other parts of the country, as human rights violations continued under the new regime, poor economic and political decisions were being made, and attempts for any degree of self-rule for any nationality were continuously silenced. Because of this, the Derg was met with resistance from the Sidama both politically and militarily. The most notable political resistor at the time was Mathios Korsissa, a Sidama man who rose to the position of secretary of the Sidamo Provincial Socialist Ethiopian Farmers Association in the early 1980s for being able to increase coffee harvesting efficiency in Sidama and Gedio areas. Unlike many of his colleagues at the time, Mathios did not brutalize the people he was sent to govern. Instead, he called out corruption and exploitation being practiced by government officials. This ended up being his downfall when he called out Tefera and Dalawe, a notorious administrator of the Sidama province, for stealing millions of birr from locals under the guise of government projects. To get rid of Mathios, his colleagues ruined his reputation by framing him for a gruesome murder that took place in Hawassa, Sidama, of a northerner and her family that he was either dating or befriended. However, at the time of the murder, he was in the Dali district of Sidama, meeting with peasant farmers. For his apparent crime, he was arrested along with his nephews by the Hawassa police, which was led by Major Chane, another northerner. During his last years in prison, he was tortured so severely that it is believed by many that to prove that he was being tortured, he sent a bag full of dead tissue in his leg to his family members. It wasn't until 1989 that he became a missing person, a common thing that happened during the Derg. However, it wasn't until 1996 that the Sidama police were able to locate and bring Major Chane, who was hiding in the north, back to Sidama to find out what happened to Mathios. He confessed to the murder of the northerner and Mathios and his nephews. Mathios and his nephews were brought to the Oromo border of Lake Hawassa to be executed and buried, and this is where the police discovered their remains. However, the Sidama did not only resist politically but militarily as well. Their most well-known military resistance to the Derg was through the Sidama Liberation Army, a guerrilla fighting group that became the predecessors of two Sidama liberation groups, the Sidama Liberation Movement and the Sidama National Liberation Front. It was created during the 1970s, around the same time other ethnic and national liberation fronts were being created for the purpose of enhancing the Sidama struggle for equality, democracy, and self-determination, and restoring the Sidama's political, economic, social, and cultural freedom and identity. The Liberation Front was able to liberate a significant portion of Sidami Gopa from the Derg. However, the liberation efforts were slowed down during the mid-80s for two main reasons. First, the rebel group was heavily outmatched when it came to combat, with an estimate of over 12,000 lives lost. Secondly, the Derg started conscripting or forcing Sidamas in squads to fight against the Sidama Liberation Army. The armed struggle never ended under the Derg, however, and is one of the many factors for the fall of the regime that are often overlooked. When the Derg was finally toppled in 1991 by a united effort of ethnic liberation fronts, most notably being the Tigray People Liberation Front, which represented the Tigray Nation located in northern Ethiopia, and the Oromo Liberation Front, representing the Oromo Nation, which is the biggest nation in terms of landmass and population. After the TPLF took over, they created a national convention in 1991 with representation from many groups of people to create a transitional government of Ethiopia. Two major groups that were supposed to represent the Sidama and the transitional government of Ethiopia were the Sidama Liberation Movement and the Sidama's People's Democratic Organization. One common trend you would see during the TPLF's rule in Ethiopia was the use of People's Democratic Organization at the end of every nationality. If you see a political party with this kind of name, it was most likely created by the TPLF as a puppet party to control a region. For example, the Oromo's People's Democratic Organization, the Afar's People's Democratic Organization, or the Argoba People's Democratic Organization. Democratic movements or National League are also names used for puppet political parties that were oftentimes controlled by TPLF. These parties rarely had the support of their own people and were oftentimes corrupted. In the case of the Sidama's People's Democratic Organization, It was created by the TPLF to appear as if the Sidamas were represented, but in reality it was just used to enforce their own policies across Sidama Gapo. To do this more effectively, the TPLF did two major moves. First, they forced the Sidama Liberation Movement out of the transitional government and into exile in 1992, along with many other liberation groups, including the Oromo Liberation Front, by harassing them, kidnapping, and killing their members, and marking them as a terrorist group. This is why the TPLF was essentially the only liberation front freely operating in the country for a period of time. Secondly, the TPLF forced a merger of many nationalities found in southwest Ethiopia, we call the SNNPR. This was done by uniting all the PDO parties in one region under a new party called the South Ethiopian People's Democratic Movement, and merging 5 regions together, the 7th, the 8th, which constituted the Sidama along with the Gedio and Burji, the 9th, 10th, and 11th regions together, claiming all 5 of these already ethnically diverse regions want to merge to a greater ethnically diverse region with nearly 60 nationalities, which was a move to further weaken the individual nation's interests than to empower them. By doing this, the Sidama voice was heavily drowned out by voices of other regions, which made it easier for the TPLF to ignore. However, like always, the Sidama don't give up. The Sidama's efforts for self-determination never ended with Menelik, the Derg, the TPLF, or the current administration. Slowly, year after year, they accomplished more and more, and for their efforts, they were finally able to vote in a referendum on their status on regionhood. And in 2019, with 98.5% of the votes for pro-separation, the Sidamas were finally granted their own region. The road to regionhood for Sidamas should not have been as hard as it was, because it was constitutional. In 2005, the Council of the Sidama unanimously endorsed Sidama statehood for the first time out of 2 attempts. Instead of being brought up to the Council of the SNNPR like it was supposed to, however, leaders who called for an autonomous region, like they always are in Ethiopia, were harassed and forced into exile. The Sidama also attempted to gain statehood through protest, one of the most well-known being the Loke Hawassa massacre, which took place on May 24, 2002. It was a peaceful demonstration calling for an autonomous Sidama region. However, when they reached Loke Hawassa, a suburb in Hawassa, they were met with live ammunition from government forces. 70 lives were murdered that day, ranging from childhood to elderly. 200 were wounded, and 1,000 were later imprisoned. Continued demonstrations and government responses similar to what happened in Loke Hawassa spread throughout the country over time, the most notable being the Oromo protests that brought change to Ethiopia in 2018. After Abiy Ahmed came to power, the Council of the Sidama once again endorsed an autonomous Sidama region, and it was brought up to the Council of the SNNPR and unanimously approved. However, their call for autonomy were once again being ignored and postponed, and the biggest demonstration seen in Sidama history took place. In the month of May, over 1 million people showed up to Hawassa, the capital of both the Sidama zone and the SNNPR, calling for autonomy. Their demonstrations grew into protests as their referendum kept getting delayed, and soon security forces started firing at protesters, resulting in many deaths. Estimates go from 20 to hundreds of lives. After continued protests and arrests, in 2019, the Sidama were finally able to cast their vote and obtain a region of their own. However, just because they obtained their own region doesn't mean they aren't facing continued political challenges. As of now, genuine Sidama politicians have either 2 choices under the current regime, either be bought out or go to jail. Fears of this region being once again dismantled are growing, and independent diaspora, media, and civic groups operating in the region are being targeted by government forces. However, just like always, the Sidama nation will continue resisting until the battle is won. Thanks for joining me as we covered our first nation in this series, the Sidama. As we continue through this series, I would like to ask for your patience as researching these nations can be hard with the lack of information out there. If you want to learn more about the Sidama, check all the sources I credited. Thanks once again for joining me in the neighborhood, and when you return next time, we'll be covering the Gurage Nation.